more complex introduction today, but I will start with, I'm John Perlow with USAID's Climate Change Office. I work on adaptation. This is the July edition of our monthly Adaptation Community Meeting. Thank you for coming. It's hot out. For making the effort to walk from the metro to wherever you came from. That was a real investment. Appreciate it. So today, we're going to hear from TANGO, and I'm going to let Chris introduce this in a few minutes. I wanted to try to explain what's going to be happening for the rest of the summer and the beginning of fall. We will not meet in August. We usually don't because we get a very small crowd, because most people with any sense in Washington. In September, it's up in the air for two reasons. The speakers will be from the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the 13-agency coordinating body, for the 13 agencies, federal agencies that invest in climate change research. They're going to be talking about the next U.S. National Climate Assessment. The last one came out a year ago. And the next one is ramping up now and will be due out, I believe, in 2018. What we don't know is whether it will be here or at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we don't know, the third Thursday of September is September 15th. That's the first week of the UN General Assembly, which may mean that people from the U.S. Global Change Research Program will be drawn up to New York. I think it's also the same week as the Ocean Conference. So mid-September is busy. So we're looking at bumping it to one of the other two Thursdays. There's a lot of Thursdays in September. I think there may be 5. The third one is the 15th, and the 29th is, I believe, the 5th. So is that possible? I guess so. So anyway. So stay tuned. I'm sorry we can't tell you definitively where it will be or when. It will be 99% certain it will be U.S. Global Change Research talking about the plans for the upcoming U.S. National Climate Assessment. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Karyn, who is the Chief of Party for the Atlas Project, which is a USAID-funded project. I'll let him explain it, and he's going to introduce our speaker and her talk.
Thanks, great. Thank you, John. So yes, I am Chris Karyn. I am the Chief of Party for Atlas. And for those who don't know, Atlas is a USAID-funded climate change adaptation program. We're about a year and a half in to a 3-year and possibly 5-year project. We do assessments. We do thought leadership activities. We do capacity development. All related to climate change adaptation to support USAID's current and emerging activities in those areas, in that area of climate change adaptation. So, and we help USAID with this monthly adaptation community meeting. And as John said, they're usually here, although we sometimes do them at the Wilson Center if it's something that's going to bring in a larger audience. So in addition to just providing a forum for talks on climate change adaptation, we're starting now, as Atlas is maturing, we're starting to work in some specific activities that Atlas is in fact implementing, and this is the first one. can be used for similar types of assessments going forward. So I will leave it at that and let Karyn explain to us all this good stuff.
Great. Thanks, Chris and John, for the introduction. Project in Ethiopia, which really is about developing an approach to assess interventions that are intended to help people better manage climate shocks, climate-related shocks. I wanted to thank Chris Perrine and Flora Lindsay Herrera in particular, and their team at Chemonics for all of the collaboration over these past several months on this particular project. And as I think goes without saying, I am just one of many people who have been involved in this project over the past several months in its various phases. So I'll do my best to give you an overview, answer questions, and hopefully have a good discussion about different tools that we can use to better understand how people make decisions and how people can better adapt to climate change. The Atlas Project was born out of the need to develop better ways to make decisions about what climate change adaptation strategies to pursue. We know households and communities are increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, manifest in increasing and more severe, more frequent weather-related events, floods, droughts, erratic and untimely rainfall. There are any number of potential strategies that we can pursue to support people in adapting to climate change. But how can we make more informed decisions about where to invest limited resources? So our fieldwork in rural Ethiopia took place last November, and that was the piece I was most intimately involved with. Now, unfortunately, that fieldwork took place in the midst of, well, in the second year of the worst drought that Ethiopia has experienced in decades. That situation gave us a chance to really take a look at some of the new or people were using to try to manage the drought a bit differently than they had in the past. In many of the discussions, people recount their experiences, back to the severe drought of 1984, hunger, water, lack of seed stocks, loss of cattle, loss of life, out-migration to distant mining areas. So they talked about all these things. And they also talked about their experience with more recent droughts over the last 10 years, and those that have created conflict within families, within communities, led to out-migration. And our research in Ethiopia really focused on those households and those communities and the ways that they were adapting and trying to manage, like I said, a bit different in these last couple of years. So this Atlas study focused on two USAID Feed the Future projects in Ethiopia, the GRAD and the PRIME projects. Now, both of these projects focus on enhancing livelihoods of chronically food insecure households and strengthening their resilience to climate change by promoting livelihood diversification, increasing incomes through improved market linkages, value chain improvements. There were two phases of the study that were implemented on these projects. The first phase is really a review of all the different types of strategies that people use to manage climate change. And the second focused more on methods used in decision analysis that were appropriate to trying to understand climate change decisions. Now, the second phase of the project, and again, the one I was primarily involved with, was the application of the selected assessment tools to the ongoing interventions that PRIME and GRAD were implementing. Now, the work generated findings at two levels, both that of the climate change adaptation interventions as well as the tools themselves. Findings were put together in a series of reports on the slides. And today, like I said, I'd like to present an overview of what we learned in Ethiopia, the process that we undertook, and some of the recommendations that we developed for choosing climate change adaptation strategies. But before we get into the findings of the research, I wanted just to clarify a few key definitions. The first one being climate change adaptation. Again, these are the definitions that were used throughout this particular study. So climate change adaptation as the use of information and improved technologies and practices to reduce risks and actually help to harness the benefits of climate change. The second one, climate change options. Climate change options, that's a term that you'll see throughout the study and one that is used as a sort of an umbrella term for all the different activities and strategies, the interventions, really, that people are using to address climate change. And finally, climate change assessment tools, or climate change adaptation assessment tools. When I see tool, I think topical outline, research tool. In this sense, it's really an umbrella term that encompasses the various methodologies and the processes that were used. I'll get into examples of these. So as we developed the assessment methodology, we focused on two sets of key questions to guide the research. The first focused on the effectiveness and the appropriateness of the climate change interventions. So we wanted to know There you go. We wanted to know what interventions are people using, why are they being adopted, or why not? Who's adopting them? Is it men? Is it women? What are the livelihood systems for which particular strategies are most effective? What are the costs? What are the benefits, the perceived trade-offs? And how do people make decisions about what to adopt? What are the criteria that they use? And finally, how have these new strategies really helped people deal with climate variability and risk? The second set of questions focused on the appropriateness of climate change adaptation assessment tools themselves. We wanted to know, to what extent are these tools complementary? How can they be best adapted to a particular research context? What skill sets, information needs, and inputs are required to actually implement the tools on the ground? And do the tools effectively and efficiently generate meaningful findings that can be used to guide decision-making for investments in climate change adaptation? There we go. So the climate change options. For each of the projects, we selected from the first review, phase 1, 10 different options. These were selected based on reviews of project documents in particular as interventions that we knew had been adopted by project participants and communities, and were also central to the project's goals of improving food security and livelihood security through increased income, increased access to markets. A few illustrative examples that I've got pictures of in these slides are water catchment and channels, canals that feed water and run off into either community or household water catchment tanks. We also took a look at what were categorized as moisture conservation strategies. So terracing, gully improvements, different strategies that were used to try to maintain water on farm, upland, prevent erosion and negative downstream effects. We also looked at a category of interventions to increase household income, primarily savings and also income diversification strategies. We looked at improvements in seeds and increasing access to improved varieties with drought-resistant or short-season early maturing crops. We also looked at efforts to expand small garden projects, typically connected with improved crops, such as our locally appropriate improved crops, such as that were often linked as well to household water catchment strategies, as well as fuel-efficient stoves. Another one that was adopted by households and appreciated by women. In terms of the tools that we selected, or that had been selected during the first phase, There were 4 tools that were identified using a mixed qualitative and quantitative set of methods. And this was done to capture breadth as well as depth across multiple stakeholder groups. We had 2 qualitative tools, participatory research and analysis and multi-criteria analysis. We also had a mixed qualitative and quantitative tool, the cost-benefit analysis. And then we had quantitative assessments or quantitative analysis of project monitoring data, household survey data. Now, the tools were selected in part because they are seen to be complementary and highly integrated. For the participatory research and analysis, we used that methodological approach to really collect more exploratory or in-depth data on how people experience climate shocks, how they perceive that experience, and the strategies that they use to manage it. For multi-criteria analysis, this is really a method that's used to systematically rank options and establish priorities when you're working with a large data set from multiple perspectives. We used MCA to rank and criteria, better understand how people decide what to adopt and when. Now, the mixed method, the cost-benefit analysis. From the qualitative perspective, the cost-benefit analysis was really used to frame the discussion so that we could dig into some of the strengths or weaknesses of the various options to better understand the trade-offs there. From the quantitative perspective, though, we also collected data from households and key informants about the actual costs, the monetary costs involved in implementing the strategies, as well as project direct costs for implementation. And the purpose of that was then to take this quantitative data to estimate a monetary cost-benefit ratio. Now, the 4th tool was this quantitative analysis of household survey data. Using the quantitative data, we could get a better look at what the adoption rates were for the projects overall, as well as in the specific sites where we were conducting the research. And ideally, to then compare the profiles of households that were adopting certain strategies compared with those that weren't. So we selected 4 research or administrative zones to conduct the research, 2 from GRAD, highlighted in orange, and 2 from the PRIME project, highlighted in red. For each zone, we selected 2 villages or kabeles. And the sites were selected to capture diversity across agroclimatic zones and livelihood strategies from both programs. For the PRIME project, we selected the semi-arid pastoral lowlands of Borana, as well as a hot, arid agropastoral zone of Jijiga in the Somali region to the east. For GRAD, we looked at a warm, semi-arid area in the southern Tigray with primarily agropastoral livelihoods. Land, cool subhuman area of the Sidama zone in SNNPR, where you find more integrated crop production, livestock production, though not as dominant as you'll find in the pastoral and agropastoral areas, and also coffee production. Now, across these sites, the primary climate shock reported, no surprise, was drought, although we also collected data related to heavy rainfall, erratic rainfall, untimely or unexpected rainfall, floods, including people also commented on high winds and frost that was affecting crops in the Sidama zone of SNNPR. So now we were able to assess the climate change adaptation options across these sites by structuring the data collection using an approach that essentially tries to validate and refine, build consensus around priorities across multiple stakeholder groups. And this technique is referred to as the Delphi Method. So in each kabele at the local level, we held separate men's and women's focus groups. And we then took a synthesis of those findings and presented it back to community level, what we called CVTs, community validation teams. They were mixed gender groups that debated the results of the men and women focus groups to identify what were the primary priorities and how are they dealing with it. And then we took findings to the third level and held with regional and zonal administrative leaders, technical representatives from NGOs, from government agencies working in climate change, environment, natural resources, food security. So I want to just pause here and make a confession as I was looking through this. I wanted to let you know that when I first looked at the scope of work for this project, I thought, well now, how is this going to be done? We've got 4 very complicated tools, MCA, CBA, Delphi techniques. We've got multiple sites, multiple villages, multiple stakeholder groups. We've got village level, community level, validation teams. We've got RBTs. How many days do we have in the field? So I thought this is asking quite a bit for 2.5 weeks of field work, combined with a quantitative analysis that had been ongoing prior to and again following, focusing on those adoption rates. Needless to say, I was skeptical. And I wasn't alone in asking those questions. I think you could say that we entered into it in terms of the fieldwork component. I speak on behalf of my colleagues here with some cautious optimism. And I think what's important and what we learned based on the experience of implementing the tools, and that is tweaking and adapting them through this pilot phase of the project, is that we were able to derive some really useful methods. And we came to see this approach as highly effective and iterative, and a way to collect a good deal of seemingly robust data in a short period of time. Oh, thanks, Laura. Well, that's okay. I didn't really want you to see that slide anyway.
Oh, up on this one. So maybe everybody should.
Well, let's see. Oh, no, I think this is a sign, because really I didn't want you to take any time on this slide. There we go, and this is why. Because what you see is too many words in a font that's too small to read. I got that. But I wanted to put it up anyway, just as an example of the kind of analysis that we did once we'd collected the data. And that was really to compare the findings about the climate change adaptation options, across the 4 tools, and looking at that by project and by region. So as I move ahead to some of the general findings that we came away with, it's important to keep in mind that these findings are the result of a pilot project. So the data are somewhat preliminary. It was a project in which we were purposefully testing the tools, refining, like I said, and adapting over time. So it's not as though the data was precisely comparable across the various sites. That said, I think we did come away with some pretty interesting learnings across the project sites that held up pretty well. Overall, we can say that in the communities where the options had been adopted, participants reported less reliance on negative coping strategies that they'd used during previous droughts. So there was less consumption, reportedly, of seed stocks, less destocking of cattle in lieu of diversification, or less destocking of livestock in lieu of diversification, such that camels were sold and used to buy cattle. Cattle were sold and used to buy shoats, which were easier to manage when fodder and water is a scarce resource. And also less out-migration. So people were quite positive in the communities where these where these climate change options had been adopted. In synthesizing the data overall and looking at the variation across the research sites, I think the key message here is the importance of having a suite of interrelated options that people can use to manage the uncertainty of climate shocks. That said, we did find a few clusters of activities that emerged as priorities. The first one, of course, being access to water. And this came out across all project sites for both grad and prime as a real priority, and across levels, community and regional, including the rainwater harvesting, point source rehabilitation, water conservation. The second main category that emerged was that of access to income. And this was particularly important in the grad project site areas, savings and livelihood diversification that allowed people to buffer against shocks, and it could be used for multiple shocks. It was equally valued for floods, for droughts. In the prime areas, access to grazing land keyed prominently. Improving land management and the government structures needed to manage dry and wet season grazing areas. There we go. So now, in addition to findings about the specific options themselves, we can see some interesting insights into what people prioritize in terms of enabling conditions or more general strategies that can be used to increase uptake. And these varied by at the local level, people very much prioritized group formation, collective action, village economic and saving associations or village saving and loan groups that were being used as venues to not only train people up on skills for savings or for marketing, but also really used as venues to exchange climate change information and better understand different strategies that were being tried in different areas, as well as building up social networks with traders and people doing business of similar sorts in other areas. Regional participants, as you might expect, tended to highlight the clustering or the layering of options at a higher geographic level. So, for example, integrated watershed management. People at the regional level, and this was predominantly for the grad programs, didn't want to talk about water harvesting. They didn't want to talk about water catchment or soil moisture conservation. What they wanted to talk about was an integrated strategy for conserving and harvesting water that was tied in with participatory planning processes at the watershed scale. But they also highlighted the value of working in what they called parallel lines. So this layering idea of focusing your interventions simultaneously at the household level, but then also at the watershed and the policy levels. In terms of the tools themselves, we did come away with an analysis of several strengths of the tools, primarily that complementarity, and that the approach really offers a framework for assessing the options, such that sort of the sum of the results is greater than the parts. We got more out of using an integrated benefit framework with the participatory topic outlines than we might have had we implemented one tool and then another. Tied into that is that the tools proved to be both very exploratory and simultaneously focused and helped us to prioritize. The qualitative work really let us kind of dig into some of the variations or to uncover new strategies that people were using. For example, indexed crop insurance was one that came up that was unexpected. There were various benefits or costs that people were able to highlight through these qualitative discussions, like a negative effect of savings, for example, money lenders. And when you pay back the money lender, you have a ceremony, you have a big party, and that builds social capital. Well, that wasn't happening anymore. But as a trade-off to that, the social organization and the social formation that they were gaining through the village economic and social associations compensated for that. So there were all kinds of interesting sort of small insights into what people perceived as the costs and benefits of these various strategies. Now, simultaneous to that, and I speak as someone who has a very difficult time prioritizing. For example, one of our respondents suggested, you want me to choose which which options, what's more important, savings or harvesting water? They're all important. And what these tools allowed us to do was to collect that broad information and see from their perspectives what it was that made these different interventions important. But then also, it required that we prioritize, that we select using the CCA method, such that each option is ranked and scored against a set of criteria, such as something's low risk or low cost. And so that indirectly allows you to come up with a list of priorities using that technique. So that combination of tools proved to be really, really effective. Another key strength was, and I did not use this word, I don't use it very often, was using the modified Delphi technique, which we'll just refer to here as validation and consensus building. And it actually did that by taking data up 3 levels from men's and women's group to a community level process of negotiation, and then up to the regional level. We were able to get those broad perspectives. Like I said, using the cost-benefit analysis and integrating that really helped us to dig into some of the trade-offs. For example, with savings, cost. Savings now is an immediate cost, but that helps us to, as people said, to drink or eat later. Livestock diversification. It decreases risk, benefit, but it also decreases status, particularly in the pastoral zones. Another strength of the tool was this focus on on clustering and sequencing. Because when you look at the quantitative data, you have a discrete list of options. So you've got 70% uptake of savings, for example. But using the qualitative techniques combined with those quantitative numbers on adoption, you could see that people really, when they think about savings, they think about it in conjunction with income-generating activities, with small garden projects linked to water conservation. So they were really thinking about things as groups of activities and how those can have benefits. Now, in terms of the challenges, there's no doubt that the primary challenge of doing this was that of time constraints. And again, we're talking 4 tools, multiple sites. It was a time burden on communities, and that we're trying to get through a pretty exhaustive list of options. And again, we're looking at 10 to 12 options in each community against 2 to 3 primary climate shock scenarios. We had to work really hard to refine those tools and make it more appropriate to a focus group conversation, a focus group forum. Keeping in mind as well that some of the people who participated in those mixed gender groups or the separate gender groups were then going to come back and form part of these community teams of experts. So that was definitely a challenge. The trade-off being that by trying to move too quickly, these ranking and scoring exercises, for example, can risk becoming a mechanical exercise, and that's not what you want for robust qualitative data collection. The second major constraint was that of data limitations. It's tough to get good monetary data on costs and benefits of interventions, and particularly the indirect benefits such as downstream effects of upland watershed management. In terms of the household surveys, it was also an issue there because we were using annual monitoring surveys primarily, and those don't collect data on household characteristics. They focus, understandably so, on monitoring outputs. But without that household level, those household level characteristics, we couldn't compare between adopters and non-adopters. A third constraint, which I alluded to earlier, idea of grounding the tools in, or grounding sort of abstract research constructs in real grounded texts. So that was a fun challenge. And I go back to a comment staff made. We're trying to do simple things to get tangible results. Techniques, whatever you want to call it, keep it simple. And that was the mantra that we tried to employ throughout the process. There's also the potential for bias, common to any research project. In this particular study, it's tied most closely to the composition of the groups themselves, particularly at the regional level, where you've got groups of sectoral experts who are going to steer the conversation towards their particular areas of sectoral expertise. And that can have an impact on your ranking results. So that was something that we really tried to tune into. But I also want to speak to this issue of researcher bias. Again, lots of tools, lots of options. So in the field, you've got to make choices about which particular climate change adaptation options or criteria are going to fall off the list. So those are some difficult choices that we made in consultation with project staff and collectively as research teams. So out of all this, we did come up with a few recommendations. And the primary one is that people need to have that suite of options available so that they can better deal with very dynamic climatic conditions. This means being able to shift in and depending on the setting, or being able to scale up or scale down activities. So you might say water harvesting or livelihood diversification, for example, in the case of drought, it's a priority. But then we need to look more closely. I'll give you an example. Both projects have been working in this area. Some participants in GRAD for the last few years have been making great strides in small business development, particularly women, retailing household goods, soaps, and small household items to fellow households in their communities and in neighboring communities. And that, in the first year of this drought, proved to be very beneficial. The second year of the drought, though, as they put it, when everyone is suffering, you can't sell to your neighbors. So products shifted into basic household food items, but also activities shifted into different types of livelihood diversification strategies. So rather than focusing so much on retail sales, they were shifting to a focus on shoat rearing, which they could continue to sell meat to the butcher if they couldn't sell soap to their neighbors. So in terms of some recommendations about the decision-making tools, thanks, Laura. So I've talked about the importance of this complementary qualitative and qualitative approach. It's also important to try to sample for diversity. We saw a great deal of variation both across projects and within projects. For example, savings proved to be very important for GRAD, but not so much for PRIME, in part because of cultural barriers to savings. People said, we save in the pockets of our neighbors. There it was social networks that really helped people buffer against drought over income generating activities. But even within projects, for example, within GRAD, TGRI, really high emphasis on reforestation and collective community landscape management, not so much for SNNPR. So we were able to pick up those variations across projects. The third thing that we wanted to highlight was the need to really consider how to scale up or scale down the way that you choose to use the tools. For example, cost-benefit analysis. How important is it for you to have an accurate cost-benefit ratio estimate? Or can you simply use the cost-benefit as a way to frame your qualitative component? If it is important to have that cost-benefit estimate, that require a separate discrete study where you're working with technical experts, the kind of monetary data that you need. In terms of general recommendations, what really emerged from the study was the importance of investing in enabling conditions for climate change and adaptation option uptake. We were interested in what factors facilitated this uptake. And one of the key factors that emerged across states, across projects, was the focus on social formation and collective action. It was the training components through these village economic and saving associations that gave people the skills and the confidence, and also the social networks that seemed to make a difference, in addition to a venue for on-the-ground field staff to have consistent follow-up with project participants over an extended period of time. As well, building on local knowledge, capacities, and resources. And this was done when the projects implemented comprehensive climate vulnerability and capacity analysis in designing the interventions and developing project design. By using a climate change lens at that phase of the project, they were able to identify what institutions and see where some of those gaps were in terms of service provision. In many cases, government projects had been implementing terracing or watershed improvement projects as part of a PSNP project in Ethiopia, but communities participate in them, as part of their PSNP work projects, not because we were relating that necessarily to the impact it was having on how they were able to manage climate change effects downhill. In some cases, agencies were they had materials available for rehabilitating water catchment tanks, but communities weren't able to access those. So it was just linking people with existing resources and services. Another key piece of this was integrating the CCA options directly with the project interventions that were focused on food security and income improvements. The last recommendation I wanted to focus on was this idea to apply a bi-level decision-making framework. And again, our project really focused on the household and community level perceptions around these various climate change options. You could simultaneously have a similar exercise at the level of donor agencies and implementing partners to see, well, what are the operational constraints? What are the resources? What are some of the issues that people are dealing with and the priorities they have at that level? And then see where those two sets of findings merge to really help better identify what types of options to choose and where to target those. So as I mentioned initially, this research has been put together in a series of technical papers, a user kit, and a guideline document that essentially presents the lessons that we learned from this process and proposes kind of an approach and some step-by-step guidance and implementation tools that can be used to implement these decision-making tools in different contexts, with examples from the grad and prime projects in Ethiopia. There we go. So in closing, I just wanted to mention that those documents, the technical report and the user guide, will be made available online via Climate Links. And we would love for you to take a look at those, what you think, and see if there's potential from your perspective to apply them in the work that you do with your agencies. Ideally, it would be wonderful to have sort of platform for sharing, so that as these tools are refined, applied in different contexts, we can collectively share from the learning on that. So I just wanted to close with a question to you about whether or not or how you think these tools might be relevant to the work you do and applied in your own institutions. So thank you very much for coming today and taking your time to be here. I'm looking forward to a good conversation. Thanks. Yeah, sure. I can have a question. We have an extra microphone as well floating around. Any questions? Crystal clear, right? Clear as mud.
All right, thank you for a great presentation. I came in a little late, so I'm sorry if I missed this, but how far into implementation did this assessment take?
No.
And then also if you could talk about how the programs took the recommendations and findings, and if and what that's incorporated, if at all, and
projects. See, GRAD was launched in 2012, or in early the following years. So I think it's a good question, but it highlights another point. This was not an evaluation of climate change adaptation options or the specific interventions that the projects had implemented. And in some cases, those interventions were really new. For example, in the GRAD project, they had started to pilot rope and washer mechanized hand pumps in areas where the water table was shallow enough for that particular intervention. Well, that had only been going on for 4 months and for 6 months maybe in a very limited zone. So this was really more of an exploratory process. And again, we can look at adoption rates as well and see that for the GRAD project or the PRIME project, adoption rates, the majority of people who had adopted the interventions actually did so before 2013. So the PRIME project was really helping to enhance the value of that, but people were already trying to do these things independently. So, and the second question that you had about how the projects are potentially integrating some of the recommendations. Again, I'm going to, Chris, do you want to respond to that one? Or?
So that's a slightly more complicated issue. This activity, as I said in my opening, I said there's still some loose ends to be wrapped up. So because of the drought and the food crisis that's been ongoing and really intensified in Ethiopia, the Ethiopia mission, who was obviously our primary audience for the not primary, but main audience, has been very busy. And so we haven't been able to get their sustained attention on this activity for some time. We had originally planned to do a presentation of the results in the spring, as far back as April, maybe. And it was delayed, and now we're hoping to do it in September. So it's only been very recently that we've shared the results, which technically are still draft, with the GRAD and PRIME projects, so they haven't reacted yet. But let me just also say that the climate change adaptation investments that were made in PRIME and GRAD were sort of at the front end of when USAID was starting to do that, and so the thinking behind how those specific interventions were structured in the context of the two projects and the way that they would be evaluated later, wasn't thought through in tremendous detail the way it would be probably now with newer projects with earmarked or designated climate change adaptation funding. So that was part of the challenge, and in many ways, I think that people in the agricultural community, the Feed the Future people, the security people, and this goes, I think, for other disciplines as well, don't necessarily think of things as this type of intervention versus this is a climate change adaptation intervention. So a lot of these interventions, I think, a lot of people would say are just good in good development sense. And in some cases, they also are very useful in terms of improving resiliency against climate variability and climate change. So I think even within the management of PRIME and GRAD, that there wasn't necessarily a deep understanding of how these specific interventions that were being funded using earmarked climate change adaptation money from USAID, how they were sort of different from things that they were already doing. So a lot of the analysis that's going on now, and some of the analysis that will go into the final evaluations for those projects, have to. And so that also explains some of the challenges that Karyn and the TANGO team faced in terms of doing the analytical work that they did. The analysis you do is only as good as the data you have. And the data that had been collected for these projects wasn't for this purpose. it was M&E data, it was other kinds of
The
data.
quantitative data.
The quantitative
Yeah.
data, sorry, right. The qualitative data obviously was perfect for this purpose. So that was another challenge.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, absolutely. And that comment about good programming, that was something that was reiterated again and again by project staff and also through project documents, was that really good climate change adaptation programming is good development programming. I think the fact that these interventions were so well integrated in the overall project approach is part of what led to some of the high adoption rates that we saw, like for the grad project, 50, 60, 80% adoption rates, and not just in the communities where we study high adoption communities. I just also wanted to add that when you mentioned the front end, I think one of the key pieces there, and that investment in climate change adaptation really goes back to the priority and the investment that was made in doing really good climate vulnerability and assessments up front, and a climate lens into their market change process as well. So really taking climate change and looking at all the various interventions from that perspective. But you also mentioned the data issues, and that's another key issue, particularly for the quantitative. And again, I mentioned the cost-benefit data. That could be a very separate, like potentially very expensive study. So we think it's useful, particularly from a qualitative perspective, and you can get some you can analyze some interventions using that cost-benefit data. We focused on 3: improved seeds, fuel-efficient stoves, and watershed management. But again, trying to assess the costs or the benefits of those environmental externalities. That's a big project. In terms of the quantitative data, I think one of the key recommendations, and Chris, you pointed this out, was that the types of information that could have been potentially useful to do those profile comparisons between adopters and non-adopters, well, understandably, like I said, not integrated into the annual household survey. Household surveys being blunt instruments, perhaps it's useful to think about other ways, other sort of short, discrete studies that can be focusing on the climate change adaptation, or to integrate, again, more specifically, again, from the quantitative studies, there were often discrepancies between what we were collecting from the qualitative data, as you might expect, and how people were defining various interventions, and what was available from the quantitative surveys. So, but again, in terms of the audience, it's specific to Ethiopia, but really they were kind enough to let us use those projects to test the tools and try to come up with an approach and a methodology that we think can be useful in other places. Yeah.
2 questions. One about Delphi panel. I used to do some Delphi panel studies, and typically draw the opinions of different experts, subject experts. So your Delphi approach was basically dealing with the community members and some education in regards to the climate changes. Right? Second question is, I assume that there must have been some preliminary studies, more kind of hardcore climate detection, some studies showing some trends over the months of showing precipitation, modeling, some natural hazards. Your team was supposed to use that information, some meaningful discussions with folks. Just would like to share.
Sure, and to respond to your second question first, again, we, of course, did take a look at climate data and long-term trends, but this project was really focused, or this study was really focused on this specific set of climate change adaptations and perceptions of the community as to whether or not they were better able to manage climate shocks, particularly drought. As I mentioned earlier, this wasn't an evaluation, and because it's not an end-line study for this particular project, we're not able to necessarily correlate some of the improvements that were reported as in relationship to the interventions with increases in household assets, those types of things. But it was a very focused study on the particular projects. We do have some pretty good quantitative data from these projects on the interim monitoring component that Prime is running in their project areas. And what we really gleaned from that is the importance of interventions that contribute to social capital. That seemed to be one of the key issues that helped people to become more resilient to climate change. In terms of the first question, the Delphi method, I'm so glad you asked me that because maybe I didn't highlight enough. This was a modified Delphi technique. The Delphi technique is something that was devised, and maybe you want to speak to this more specifically, but devised in the 1950s, perhaps for a different type of audience, in which you could on your computer and you could fill out a questionnaire or a matrix. And the idea is essentially that you're taking the same questions and you're asking them again and again to various panels of experts. So for this project, when we're trying to get a sense of how people are perceiving and experiencing climate change and how they're applying strategies, they're our experts, and we were focused on their experience. So that's why, in part, we use the Delphi technique as a way to structure the data collection at the community level. So to start first with these two groups, focus groups, men and women, develop a list of priorities, identify criteria, collect information on what the impacts of using those strategies would be, that data, synthesize it, bring it back to a subset, including some experts from the community, some technical experts, for example, ag extensionists or project staff, and sit together. And again, these were typically groups. We found that for the second level analysis, these community validation teams, it was really useful to have a group of about 6 people, 3 men and 3 women, and then to have this process of negotiation and then a systematic ranking exercise. And then again, we took that to the third level, which was this group of representatives from non-governmental organizations, from government agencies, working in relevant fields. So it was Delphi, the modified Delphi. So maybe one from this side, yeah.
Thank you. So I had a question about prior to presenting them with these tools as a test.
No.
Was there no level of self-organizational? They had to be circumstances changed. To what extent were they already sort of forming groups to address this, and what sort of approaches were they in the process of taking? And I don't want to use the word tools because it's really sort of an approach, which we might use the word tool, but they might say, we'll take this. So, to what extent was that already done? And,
That's another good question. And I'm thinking of many specific examples. Now, of course, there were existing community organizations, and as I alluded to as well, a lot of these strategies may or may not have already been employed by the community. For the GRAD project, for example, we saw that the majority of people were using these strategies as a result of the project interventions. That wasn't necessarily the same for the PRIME project. Lots of different kinds of community organizations, right? There were a lot of different groups that were collectively working on, community terracing or community watershed management. So there's sort of 2 things to highlight there. One is that I think the project was able to specifically try to build on those local organizations and local interventions and improve them. And that might have been improvements with improved materials, such as concrete or plastic lining or water catchment, providing wire for gully improvements and bunding or terracing. So some of that was material. But then the other piece of that, I think, really ties into just backing up, using savings, for example. In Tigray, the partner there, REST, had already been implementing for some time, years, savings associations. So they said, well, we don't need these village economic and saving associations. We already have our own form of the VESA. And over the course of the project, they did, in fact, uptake this VESA platform, because what they realized is that it was really a much more integrated way to address savings, skills training, and really bring climate change into those conversations. So yes, they were very much trying to build on things that people were already doing and improve those. And in some cases, bring in some new interventions. For example, savings was less common in the Sidama zone previously. So that's something that has been somewhat introduced by the project. Yeah, Chris.
This is more a question, I guess, Karyn. But to what extent did the more, kind of the traditional community structures, the tribal structures and things that historically have been kind of a bulwark for resiliency and social capital, to what extent did you find that those were important to dealing with climate shocks and other kinds of issues associated with these climate change adaptation?
Well, I think one example to highlight, and I was in the grad area, so I focused my work in Tigray and SNPR. But my colleague Suzanne Nelson, who was in the Prime region, one of the things that really stood out was the indirect effects, important effects of the drought, particularly on increasing conflict over land resources, and the breakdown of the BADA system, the traditional governance system for managing the wet and the dry grazing systems. And as a result of the drought, so conflict was increasing, the traditional leaders were out-migrating, and the traditional governance structures were beginning to deteriorate. So people said, if you really want to focus on climate change, if you really want to improve grazing, then what you need to focus on are those governance structures that are pre-existing and long-standing, but as a result of these severe and successive shocks have deteriorated. Okay, sorry, thanks.
Talk a little bit about it. That you observed if there were shifts in how the gender responded, approaches, dynamics that were.
Yeah, good question. And just to be upfront, I think that's one thing that we could do better in this project, to highlight more of the gender aspects of adoption and impact. That said, the adaptation strategies that were selected were also selected on the basis of gender. For example, fuel-efficient stoves. It did, reportedly help reduce the impact on forests, but that intervention was selected primarily because of the potential benefit for women. Water pumps being another example. So that was a criteria that was used in selecting that, that subset of 10 different options. In terms of some of the impacts we saw, and again, this is, it was pretty interesting. The GRAD project works specifically with women to help build their capacity in small business development and savings. So there were a few sort of tangible and intangible benefits that really emerged from this. One has to do with kind of the actual income that women were gaining as a result of the interventions. But another one seems to deal a lot more with those intangible aspects of building confidence and having leadership roles in their VESA organizations. And we heard a lot of stories about positive effects on family dynamics. That when families, when households are less stressed, when they have more options to cope with drought, there was less fighting between family members. There was less, we heard during the last drought, I had to run away with my children. But now, we've developed some skills. And even the way that the VESA organizations function, when we would sit down for the mixed gender meetings, it was kind of, and this is just an anecdote, but what was interesting is that, first you'd see all the women sit on one side, and then all the men, would sit on the other side, and then everyone would sort of stop and look at each other and get up and trade places. And they really seem to, as a group, and again, a small group, make an effort to have an equal voice within that process of negotiation and discussion. So those are just a few of the sort of observations, but I think we need to do more systematic research that's focusing on that particular component. And again, keeping in mind this is all pilot, so it would be ideal to do this in more places with more participants.
I recently got back from West Africa, where I was on a farmer-to-farmer trip to a community of small farmers that are dealing with several fights, and seems to be an ongoing order. And I have an opportunity to possibly go back. And so I'm thinking about tools I can approach that challenge in a more organized fashion. And my question is, of the conditions necessary for success, both in preparation on the part of the facility, and also whether simply practice and stateside go, and then conditions necessary field pretty establish what can be the ground perhaps before you go, so that drive this chance of taking a process that's going to be useful.
Yeah, well, hopefully those toolkits and guidance documents will be available soon on Climate Links. And really what we tried to do was take that first step of taking what were somewhat broad, cumbersome, and to some extent, when I'm thinking about the multi-criteria analysis or the way that we adapted the Delphi technique, just sort of vague, abstract, cumbersome approaches that we really worked hard to boil down. And so the toolkits and the guidelines really do present kind of a step-by-step process on how to implement these tools. They provide templates for facilitating sessions, for recording data, for analyzing the data, for a structure. It's not a one-size-fits-all, right? It's a proposed process. So in terms of making the tools useful, I think and manageable, I think the first question really is to think carefully about what your objectives really are, and then to tailor your tools for those particular objectives. Maybe you don't need to have, if you're working in a single community, you don't need to have, we were looking at a broad quantitative set across 2 projects. So, you can focus in on only the qualitative tools, for example. The second thing, and I'm glad you mentioned this, was pilot. And in part, this had a lot to do with making sure that the terms that we were using and the strategies that we were talking about. We never used the word strategies. We never used the word Delphi. We never used the word criteria. We talked about people's human experience with drought, how it was affecting their capacity to farm, to feed their families, to access water, and what specifically were they doing about that on a daily or seasonal basis, to really put it in grounded terms. And then, again, that piloting. So if you have an opportunity to pilot. And again, in this particular study, the argument was, well, this is the pilot. So, we specifically tried and adapted the tools. We tried different things in different places to try to get a better sense of what works to get the best kind of data.
So following on the question about tools, you kind of carried out the assessment in two different. Did you find that the use of different at all between two locations? Why?
They did. Well, I should respond to that. And again, just to highlight that because it was a pilot, they differed dramatically in all the sites. Because, like I said, we were really trying to refine the tool. So it was basically a process of taking, 4, like I said, somewhat cumbersome and lengthy tools. Like I said, I don't know how we're going to do this, and really taking those and again working with project staff very closely, and working, drawing on the quantitative data and doing a lot of the review of the project documents to define what the specific parameters or indicators were, how we were going to phrase those questions, trying our best to keep it simple. So a lot of conversations, discussions, and meetings with project staff, both before and once we got to Ethiopia. Training with our partners from Green Professional Service who helped us in conducting the qualitative research. And then a process of implementing the tools, sitting down every day at the end of a long day with all of the research team members, with project staff, to say, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what can we do differently tomorrow, and then trying something different. And so I want to apologize publicly to those first communities where we implemented this project, because we took a lot of their time and they were very patient. And it was simultaneous, but in fact it was about a month and a half altogether, in that I visited the Sidama and the Tigray areas first, and then my colleague came in. So we also met midway, exchanged information, exchanged tools that we had developed, the actual tools. When I say tools here, I am talking about the templates and the guidelines that were used during the data collection. So then she was able to take those and refine them further.
I'm curious to understand a little bit better how you have two projects that have a prevention function, and your work with adoption. Were some of those areas outside human area that's away but is doing that practices? Secondly, since you mentioned a few of them are kind of minor human area, what influence, definitely those grants programs to this, and I want to be sure one thing is adoption. We get a lot of technical, a lot of money, or whatever, to adoption, because they see the practice and so.
A lot of good questions there. I'll try to make sure I answer them. Costs in terms of, I think a lot of what you're talking about, we were able to tease out using that multi-criteria analysis tool. And again, getting into this variation, we did see variation across sites in terms of how people were making decisions and what the priorities were. But some of the primary criteria were low cost, labor, low risk, low labor investment. So that very much figured into the calculations. And the way that the multi-criteria analysis works is that you take a set of weighted criteria at low cost, low risk, feasible in terms of material resources, time resources, and then you rank each of the adaptation options against those criteria. So it gives you this matrix at the end that allows you to, it basically gives a score to each of those intervention options against the criteria, which include those very factors that you just mentioned. In terms of, you hit upon something else, things that were happening in the treatment area that might have been happening in other areas. Two things. One of the criteria for adopting interventions actually tied into this idea of aspirations, or to what extent is a particular strategy tested and proven. So, well, for example, moisture conservation on farm. They were experimenting with things like digging micro basins around coffee plants for like very micro level water catchment. And in addition to some of these larger, more labor intensive, community level, I should say, interventions. A lot of skepticism about that, right? But wait a second, I saw my neighbor try that, and this year, his coffee production, he's doing all right. So aspirations was a key criteria, and it might have been things that people were observing in the treatment area, outside of the treatment area. Creating platforms for exchanging information extended beyond the areas where we were doing this study. So people commented on how those networks were helping them to exchange information and collect ideas about how to cope with similar problems within a given agroclimatic zone. There's lots of good stuff right there.
Good research. I love it.
Andre's question.
Okay.
We'll have a very quick one.
My question was about, you went into this particular study with a climate change lens. I'm curious if you've gone into this study as a livelihood study or a household economy study or take any other lens you want that we would use in a rural context. I'm curious if you think that you would come up with methodologies and or results, or whether this same stuff would apply. And is there anything specifically from if you were doing this research with this climate change perspective, is there anything particular you would do to make sure that perspective is in there, or is this just good development and we carry on, and is this just good in a rural household analysis and we carry on, or is there something distinctive about this because it's done with a climate change lens? Does that follow on the program?
That's a good question. I'm thinking. I think the tools themselves are relevant to different types of development programming that aren't necessarily focused on climate change. You would be looking at a different set of options, different set of strategies, criteria. I think one of the things I've tried to highlight is that with the value lens into the livelihood programming, and as Chris suggested, a lot of these, when the projects decided to adopt, climate change approach, it was, well, what did we learn from, what are we already doing? And how does that relate to climate change adaptation? And then doing these climate change vulnerability assessments or adaptation assessments on the ground to really ground that and to really focus in on climate change. So, yeah, good climate change programming is good development programming. So I think the tools could definitely be adapted for other contexts. Also, I think we came away with the thinking that these tools can be used in a complementary way with your initial project assessments. And those may be climate change assessments, livelihood assessments, but they're not a stand-in for that. They're also, like I said, they're not an evaluation. They're certainly not an impact evaluation, but they're a way that you can sort of come in at a certain point in the project, perhaps midterm evaluation, when you're trying to figure out, well, what's working, what's not, what are people perceiving, as most effective? Where do we need to focus our resources for the remainder of the life of the project? Or we're scaling up. So these tools, I think, can be very useful in getting at that kind of information.
So probably very question on your response is you comment on possibilities to collate a lot of to what already exists or going with or what TANGO has done in terms of analysis on poverty, but also data that's coming from small-scale irrigation lab, other future activities within it. So it seems like somebody asked something about gender and women. So what are some pathways there? It sounds like
Interesting question, and maybe if I can put some of my colleagues on the spot here, affiliated with TANGO International, and how, and again, I'm putting you on the spot. We haven't talked about this, but to what extent you think some of these tools might be integrated with or benefit from the work on climate change or other quantitative analyses that are ongoing. And I'd like to introduce Laurie Starr with the TOPS program, putting on the spot. And yeah, and I apologize, and Lloyd, but if
to comment on how these particular tools
might,
I have to be quite honest, I'm not familiar enough with the tools. I was here to learn as well. But my guess is, just knowing the background of the research, security research that TANGO is founded, they any of out there. I'm not sure if the question you're asking is why something else. What? We've already got a lot. I need something. Is that the question being asked?
It's really more like what more additional benefit can we wring out of what you've already done and what you're supporting in other streams of work.
So what are the distinctly different pieces? So what Andre asked, what is distinctly different? It's just, I can't answer that. I don't know the tools that well.
And again, when we conduct a livelihoods assessment or a vulnerability assessment, we're using typically a mixed methods approach, right? Where we're focusing on quantitative household surveys together with qualitative data to contextualize that information. So it's very much drawing on that whole body of work. I think one thing that's different, and again, I put you on the spot there because of my lack of familiarity with all of the various projects that TANGO has ongoing. But I think one of the things, so I say this with that background, but I think one of the key things that seems to me to be slightly different about this from a TANGO perspective was really trying to integrate. And typically we'll have, again, household surveys, quantitative data together with a whole series of qualitative tools that are used around, community mapping, seasonal calendars, typical diagramming, lots of different tools that we have available. But here we really tried to look, rather than what kinds of tools we could integrate into the participatory research and analysis component, and look more at trying these sort of new methods that we gleaned from research around decision analysis specific to climate change. And I'm thinking primarily about this multi-criteria analysis and the sort of the templates and the kind of analysis that went into that, and was then integrated together with the cost-benefit analysis and sort of your traditional topical outline and key informant interviews. So again, and my apologies again for putting you on the spot.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Karyn and TANGO one more round of applause. Again, we'll do an event in September. It will feature the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the planning for the next U.S. National Climate Assessment. But I looked during the presentation, the Ocean Conference is at the same time as the third Thursday, so it probably won't be the third Thursday. And I'm not sure if it'll be here or at the Woodrow Wilson Center, but we will clarify that and email you in late August or early September. No meeting in August, so don't shut the Kamonics. I'm sure the guard would be happy to see you, but there won't be cookies and soda and no speaker. So we'll see you in September, and we'll let you know where we'll see you and when closer to September. Thank you very much. Thanks, Karyn.
Thank you. And